Cannabis Common Sense, the show that tells the truth about marijuana and the politics behind its prohibition.
Hello and welcome to another exciting edition of Cannabis Common Sense. We have a great interview for you tonight. An old friend, Angela Bacca, who has been publishing several doctors' books here and has a long history of working in the movement. So stand by for that interview. We have a detailed but short hemp news segment coming up. And so stay tuned as we bring on our infamous dancing cannabis leaves.
I feel the force.
Our first story on hemp news tonight is from the federal government. Hundreds of pages of recently released documents provided by the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, affirm that the overwhelming majority of the public has known for decades marijuana possesses therapeutic efficacy and its harms are not on par with those of heroin or even alcohol. Those were the explicit conclusions of the nation's top federal health agencies, along with the Food and Drug Administration and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, in a letter to the Drug Enforcement Administration calling on the agency to remove botanical cannabis from its Schedule I prohibitive status in the Federal Controlled Substances Act. By definition, Schedule I substances are federally criminalized because they possess no currently accepted medical use in the United States and a high potential for abuse and lack of accepted safety under medical supervision. Cannabis has remained classified as a Schedule I controlled substance since 1970. From Florida, Republican lawmakers in Florida are advancing legislation preemptively banning the sale of certain cannabis products to adults. Under existing state law, adults may not legally possess or purchase cannabis absent an authorization from a physician. However, in the coming weeks, justices on the Florida Supreme Court will decide whether to allow a ballot proposal legalizing the possession and retail sale of marijuana for adults in Florida to appear on the November 2024 ballot. Proponents of the initiative have gathered the requisite number of signatures to qualify it for the ballot, but Republican Attorney General Ashley Moody has asked the court to invalidate the measure over what she believes to be misleading language in the initiative's text. The AG's office used a similar tactic to invalidate a 2022 legalization initiative. Across the river in Washington State, members of Washington State's House Committee on Regulated Substances and Gaming have advanced legislation, HB 2194, allowing adults to home cultivate personal use quantities of cannabis. As amended and passed in the committee, it permits an adult to grow up to 4 marijuana plants in their residence or up to 10 plants per household. Those who grow additional plants would be subject to civil penalties. Committee members passed the bill on a 7-4 vote. Despite having been one of the first 2 states to initially legalize the adult use marijuana market, Washington is one of only 5 legalization states that disallows home cultivation. So I urge my Washington viewers to contact their legislators and ask them to pass HB 2194. That's HB 2194. On a nationwide basis, 17% of those between the ages of 18 and older say that they smoke marijuana, according to nationwide survey data compiled by Gallup. That percentage is more than double the percentage reported by Gallup in 2013, when states initially began legalizing and regulating the adult use market. By contrast, data compiled by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and others report that current cannabis use among young people has fallen dramatically during this same period. Young adults, men, and Democrats were most likely to report being current cannabis consumers. Out of Boulder, Colorado, patients with moderate anxiety report experiencing increased sleep quality following their use of cannabis, according to data published in the journal Behavioral Sleep Medicine. Out of Aurora, Colorado, daily cannabis consumers exhibit fewer changes in performance than those who use it less frequently, according to data published in the Journal of Cannabis Research. The study, Effects of Acute Cannabis Inhalation on Reaction Time, Decision-Making, and Memory using a tablet-based application, appears in this month's Journal of Cannabis Research. Out of South Carolina, members of the South Carolina Senate gave final approval last week to legislation SB 423, the Compassionate Care Act, to provide authorized patients access to certain medical cannabis products. After several days of debate, senators voted 24-19 to send the legislation to the House for further consideration. In 2022, House lawmakers refused to take up a similar bill. 76% of registered voters in South Carolina support medical cannabis access, according to polling data compiled last year by Winthrop University. South Carolina is one of only a dozen states that has yet to implement a comprehensive medical cannabis access program. Lawmakers in the Hawaiian House and Senate have provided initial approval to multiple marijuana reform bills. In Hawaii's House chamber, members of the Committee on Judiciary and Hawaiian Affairs approved HB 1596, which reduces penalties involving the possession of marijuana up to 1 ounce and related paraphernalia to only a $25 fine and a non-criminal offense. Committee members also advanced HB 1595, which facilitates state-initiated expungements of those with misdemeanor cannabis convictions. Members of South Dakota's Senate and Health Human Services Committee voted 5-2 to stop or defer any further action on legislation SB 82 that sought to restrict many patients' medical cannabis access. We're happy to report that. Our last story tonight is from Virginia. Just ahead of the crossover deadline for the 2024 legislative session, members of both chambers of Virginia's legislature approved competing measures to legalize and regulate the retail sale of cannabis to adults 21 and older. Both bills initiate retail use cannabis sales by January 1st of 2025. Delegate Paul Creek's HB 698 proposes a tax rate of 9% in lieu of any state or local retail sales tax, whereas Senator Aaron Rouse's SB 448 imposes a 16% tax in addition to any state and local sales taxes. That's the end of our Hemp News segment tonight. If you or a loved one are looking for help finding a doctor who can recommend medical marijuana, we have a referral service and can help you locate doctors all across the country. Call us at 503-235-4606. That's 503-235-4606. Here's this evening's interview, and help us restore hemp.
I'd like to introduce Angela Bacca. Angela lived here in Portland for quite a while. She's been a writer. She's written several articles about the corporate takeover that I went through, and worked with various publishers, and now working. Do you have your own publishing company now, Angela? Well, and is that
FlowerValley.press?
There it is. And this is one of your latest
first book.
Well, that's a great first book, and I was really happy to interview Dr. Joe Goldstrich back in November. It was one of my favorite interviews. So that was your very first book, huh?
As a self-publisher, yeah.
Yeah, and so and is the biography of Luke Scarmoza. Am I saying his name right?
High Price, Luke Scarmoza, and that's an autobiography. Or I wouldn't say it's so much a biography because it's not his life story. It's his story of what brought him into prison as federal cannabis prisoner in California during the legal years.
Yeah, San Diego, which was the worst place to be.
Actually, he was in Modesto, which is the very conservative Central Valley.
Yeah. And so do you have other books in the pipeline?
Yeah, actually, in March, we're going to be releasing Cannabis in Clinical Practice with Dr. David Behrman, Maria Pettinato, PhD RN, and Carolina Nossetti, MD, and myself. That was written by Dr. Behrman, who's a really, really great friend of mine here in the Santa Barbara area, who's been seeing patients since Prop 215 in California. And he wrote this book to be all of the medical drug fact information that doctors need that was not there for cannabis, stuff like toxicology, dosing, dependence, liability, contraindications. Over the years, it's morphed a bit. Dr. Pettinato got involved, and she teaches at the College of Nursing at Seattle University, so she kind of adjusted it to be a textbook. And then Dr. Carolina Nossetti from Brazil kind of adjusted it to be more medical for the doctors that she's educating in Brazil. And then I edited and rewrote big chunks of it as somebody who's been a medical cannabis patient for about 20 years this year, actually. So I was able to kind of infuse that perspective in there too. So that'll be out in March. We've also done 2 children's books under the imprint Little Simia, and those are about to be released as well.
Little Simia, who wrote that?
So the imprint of the company is called Little Simias. So all of our children's book brands are Little Simias, which Simia means seeds in Spanish, and we're making them all bilingual children's books. I have a 2-year-old at home. My husband is from Madrid and Ecuador originally, and we're raising her bilingual, and we were shocked that in Southern California there really aren't a ton of bilingual kids books options, so we're making them.
All right. So you're writing them?
I've been writing them, yes.
All right. And you've got, how old is your daughter now?
Almost 2.5.
Okay. So you've got a perfect audience to share that with.
And she's obsessed with books. So she's been my little focus group as well.
Yeah, my kids were too. We would read to them every night. Good memories. They're all grown now, and it's way in the past. But anyway, so let's go way back and talk about how you first became interested in cannabis. You know, I was at a babysitter's house when I was 11, and the babysitter's son came back from Vietnam and turned me on to marijuana back in 1972. And so I started pretty young. You want to share anything along those lines?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up in Southern California. I'm originally from Orange County. I have family all over Orange County and LA, but I grew up in the Santa Barbara area in a town called Lompoc. And I was 10 years old when Proposition 215 passed in California. So, and I had uncles and my dad who smoked a ton of weed that we all kind of knew about, but didn't talk about it. So I always saw cannabis as not a drug in the way I was learned about the other drugs at DARE. I knew people with cancer used cannabis. I kind of had that vibe, but I also was like a super rebellious kid. So as a teenager, my best friend and I were always of the, as soon as we get our hands on it, we're going to try it, right? So the first time I smoked cannabis was at the Lompoc Christmas Parade in 1999 in an alley. Didn't even get high. We had it on a paper clip, a joint that we were trying to smoke. But about a year later, we both started getting a regular flow of it and loving it. And the fun thing about that was I was in Catholic school. I was rebelling against it. I hated it. I was intentionally flunking myself out of like honors math classes and stuff. And then the very, very first time I got high, a little light bulb went off in my head, which was, wow, if I ever want to get out of this small town, I should go to college. So I started smoking weed, and all of a sudden I'm running for student body secretary, I'm getting A's, I'm going back into AP classes with the goal of getting out of my small town. So my senior year of high school, I started having just like severe stomach cramping pain, just really, really bad. Nobody knew what it was. I would just not eat for as long as I could because if I ate, I was in pain. So I just didn't eat. And 3 days before I went to college in San Francisco, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And at that point, it was pretty severe. I had a stricture, a blockage. So what happens is your colon closes, and even just passing liquid like water becomes extremely painful. And it's funny because when I got the diagnosis, I immediately, it was like, well, I got to stop doing drugs. I got to stop smoking weed, right? So I stopped smoking weed and I get prescribed handfuls of pharmaceuticals. And the first 6 months were just hell. And of course, I'm in San Francisco. So every free newspaper I'm picking up has got cannabis ads all over the back of it. This is 2004 at this point. And so right around the time I had my surgery, March of 2005, I remember asking my doctor about it. I'm like, do you think medical cannabis could help me? And she says, I can't talk to you about that, but you might want to look into it. I said, okay. And so I went and saw a medical cannabis doctor in San Francisco for the first time in 2005. And he actually told me more about my condition than I had ever learned from a gastroenterologist or a medical doctor. And I got a card and I started going into the dispensaries in San Francisco. And at the time, you would get cannabis in a plastic Ziploc baggie with like a little printer label off of it. And there were actually people smoking in the dispensaries. And it just seemed so cool. And I was so into it. And so that's how I started really getting into the cannabis space, was as a patient in the early 2000s. And I was studying journalism at San Francisco State University. And by the time I was on the student newspaper, we were all giving out our pitches for what we wanted to cover. And I asked if I could cover the medical cannabis scene, because at this point it's 2006 and things are starting to emerge in the Bay Area and actually really become a structured scene. And my managing editor said, no, you just want to get high. You want to talk about drugs. I threw a little bit of a fit. And our senior editor was actually like, no, this is a story that's big international news and it's happening here in the Bay Area. Angela can cover it. So I started covering cannabis in the Bay Area then around 2006, and I met a woman named Claire Birch. I'm not sure if you knew her, but Claire was a documentarian in the Bay Area who followed around Dennis Leary and like a bunch of other kind of big names in that world. And she had walls in her home in Berkeley full of VHS tapes. And one of her big projects was throughout the entire lead up to Prop 215, starting an AIDS epidemic, she was following around Dennis Perone and a lot of other people in the Bay Area and documenting everything that happened the 5 years before and after Prop 215. And so I met Claire, and she was on her deathbed at the time. She was pretty old, but she just kind of blew my mind a little bit about what was going on there. So that's kind of what really made me look a little bit closer at the cannabis industry. And then after I finished college, I got my first job working for Ed Rosenthal, who publishes cannabis books out of Oakland. And from there, the rest is history.
I see. So, how did you? What sort of books did you start with? Ed has grow books and a whole variety of other topics. I know. So you worked as a kind of an aide in his office.
I was his editorial assistant. So part of my job was he wrote regular columns for different cannabis magazines. So I would edit those columns and make sure they got delivered to the magazines. I organized all of his magazines and photos, which was really fun. But my very first book project was the 2010 edition of the Marijuana Growers Handbook, which is Ed's core book that first came out as the Marijuana Growers Guide with Mel Frank in I think 1978 or 79, and has been continually updated and republished all the way through 2021. So that was my crash course in book production, in cannabis horticulture, and like most of the cannabis world. And the other thing that was really interesting about working on that book at that time was when I first started working for Ed, George W. Bush was president, and the cannabis industry was smaller than it is today. But we were also now at 2008, 2009 was right around the time Richard Lee was getting ready to run Prop 19 out of Oakland. And so I was in and around Oaksterdam while Prop 19 was happening. I decided to get an MBA at Mills College in Oakland during Prop 19. And so I was there right before the Green Rush really started. And I would say like the start of the Green Rush was the Ogden memo in 2009, right after Obama became president, because it was, I didn't know that.
Tell our audience what the Ogden memo is.
Yeah, so when Obama became president, he was inaugurated in 2009. A month later, Attorney General Eric Holder released a memo that basically said the new administration's policy on medical cannabis was if people were compliant with their state law, the feds were going to look the other way. And it was like someone had flipped a switch, right? When I had first met everyone in the medical cannabis world, it was kind of just like a small, dinky little thing, to be real, right? Like a bunch of old hippies. And right after the Ogden memo, all of a sudden there's like massive conferences at the Staples Center in downtown Los Angeles. And all these people that I know are suddenly on national news and kind of blowing up all over the place. And so like that little flipped switch is what started Prop 19, which kind of started the whole legalization movement, and also is what just skyrocketed cannabis into what it is today, was like that one little move.
Yeah, the Ogden memo. So that, how did it progress from there for you?
So, it was interesting for me because I was in the heart of what was going on during Prop 19. I'm always the kind of person who likes to be behind the scenes. Like, I know everyone, but I don't really like to be out in front of things.
I know. I've had trouble getting you on this show. You stood me up sometimes in the past. But now that you have your own publishing company, you're willing to help promote that. So I'm happy to finally have you on the show.
You've never actually asked me before.
Well, you were going to come on with Madeline, and you were going to do a Oregon initiative and stuff.
Oh, right.
Not bad. It's been a long time, but I've been doing this show a long time, since 1996.
With stuff like that initiative, right? Madeline, I love Madeline Martinez, love her, but she makes it easy for me to hide because she likes to be in front. So I'm happy to be like, oh, no, talk to Madeline, not me. But I'm the only one who can represent me. So, what was interesting is we
had a little back and forth. In the end, you didn't come on, but that was years ago.
Probably when I lived in Portland, and I moved out of Portland in 2019, which somehow 5 years have gone by. I think COVID kind of stopped time in a way. So with Prop 19, that was an interesting experience for me because I knew everybody involved. And for those who weren't really around in Prop 19, California has always been in favor of legalization in the 2000s, right? Polling-wise, California was ready for legalization. Prop 19 barely didn't pass, right? We were talking about 3 percentage points. And one of the big reasons Prop 19 did not pass, besides the fact that everybody's got there's a few things going on, right? Like everybody's got their big egos, but in a state like Oregon, you have one major metro area. In a state like Colorado or Washington, one major metro area. In California, we've got 3, 4, 5 of them, and some parts of the state are a 16-hour drive from other parts of the state. And because of that, you don't necessarily have one California, and it's a lot harder to get people to unite around something going on in the Bay Area if they don't feel like what's coming out of the Bay Area serves them. So we had all of these disparate factions in California at the time, but what it really came down to was there was a whole contingent in the cannabis community who was opposing Prop 19. for many of the reasons people oppose legalization from within the cannabis community now. You had growers in Northern California who thought it would destroy their livelihood, and they were right. And you had people who thought it was going to just end up on being a ton of taxes for legalization, which they were right. All of these things came to pass, but there's also can you say which was better? Would we have been better off if there were still federal raids, if people were still in prison, if children didn't have access, if sick people didn't have access, if people were still going to prison to provide that access, right? It wasn't just about the patient getting it, it was how it got to them in the first place, and somebody has to produce it. Right, like what I saw though was just, what I saw during Prop 19 was this interesting fracturing of a community that used to be very solid and united and together into many different factions. And legalization, Prop 19 proved that legalization was coming, even if it wasn't that version of legalization. And 2 years later, we had Washington and Colorado pass legalization. But I definitely started paying attention a little bit more to the nuances of what was going on in the cannabis community. And what was going on in the cannabis community was what was going on in the rest of the world at the time, right? In 2009, Facebook skyrocketed. All of a sudden, everybody's on Facebook. Like, we'd had MySpace and Friendster and stuff before, but Facebook really was like the nexus of social media at the time. And all of a sudden, you've got people who go out there gung-ho to try to get something done, and they're using it as an organizing tool. And now they've got all these weird trolls coming out of nowhere trying to expose them or make people think negatively of them. You've got people using it as their ego boost, and that's really what fractionalized people the most. And so I started really paying attention to internet trolling as it was in and around cannabis legalization campaigns. But don't forget that this was happening around every political campaign. And part of the reason the trolling was happening around cannabis campaigns was because it was happening, there are actual people paid, both Democrats and Republicans, to do the same work for every other election in the country, right? Like, trolling has become an industry. And so cannabis really brought me into that world of trolling, and it made me follow this other path into how you have such a tight-knit movement that ends up hating each other a few years later. And that's where we are with cannabis in a big way. And I got just really down that loop and ended up covering it in Florida and Ohio, different cities in California, all over the country. I just started seeing all of these patterns by watching different legalization campaigns and the trolling that came up around it. So that became a big focus of my freelance work for a long time, was writing about that kind of stuff. And I know you're no stranger to it either. Everybody is, go ahead.
That's another thing that the growers and community warned us about, was this corporatization of cannabis and how the big companies would come in and steal our business. And I think I was one of the first people in their target for that. And you covered that very well. You covered it better than any other person. You wrote a couple of pretty big articles about it. And I know you did a lot of research on that.
Well, and see, that's interesting, because I've had a lot of people come to me wanting me to go do an expose on XYZ, right? But the reason I was able to write what I was for you was that I was sponsored by GreenAid to do legal research. So most journalists don't get paid very much to produce things like this. And so the reason I could write what I wrote about your case was that I was able to go through weeks of discovery, right? I knew your case inside and out. I had read every email, I'd read every text message, I'd read everything. And a normal journalist does not get to do that. Like, there's no funding for something like that in most places.
Yeah, so you have a ton of information. And so there's a couple of articles. One, you wrote it first, and then a follow-up. The first one was pretty big, and then a follow-up. I think the first one was it Huffington Post? Or and the next one was on medium.com, I know. And that was, you're at the trial where I was basically cheated out of having a trial. I think the corporate people realized that a jury was going to rule against them, and I wasn't going to let a judge take it. You know about the judge corruption in that case. But then you followed similar situations all across the country, working with the Cannabis Museum Investigative Fund.
Mm-hmm. That investigative fund still exists if anybody ever wants to pour money into it. My time has moved more towards producing books these days, but the Cannabis Museum had sponsored me to work on a piece about the legalization campaign in Ohio. And anybody who's seen or followed that at all would understand just how insane legalization was in Ohio. Ohio was an interesting situation because Ohio had a ballot initiative in 2015, an off year, right? Like, most people don't do their elections for cannabis legalization in an odd number year. And what would have made that unique if Ohio had passed was that, well, there's a few things, but one of the big pieces there was that it would have been the first state to bypass medical and go straight to full legalization, which really was the pattern. That's where we should have been moving, right? We should have been acknowledging that, yes, this substance is very important for people with medical conditions. Free it, let people use it, study it, but now we also have to acknowledge that it's safe enough for other people, that people are going to do it anyway, and that continuing prohibition based on lies is wrong, right? Great, this is great that we're going to go straight to legalization here. But there's a catch.
Ohio thing, as I recall, set up 10 people who could be the producers, and no one but them.
And that's the catch, right? That was the catch, is that the 10 funders of the campaign started 10 businesses, and only those 10 businesses could grow and produce all of the cannabis in Ohio. And that became incredibly contentious, right? Because that group of 10 investors had already made their investment in this market, and they had an incentive to see it pass. So you start seeing the trolling really ramping up and dividing people in that community. And again, remember, Ohio, until recently, was the bellwether state. Because it was a swing state in presidential elections. It's not so much anymore, but it used to be a swing state. And so you had very active Democrat and Republican parties in Ohio. That was the federal battleground for presidential elections for a while. And so you had very powerful parties and very, very well set up infrastructure. Being out in California, right? Our parties work on state. Our Republican and Democrat party are focused on state. They don't have any power in the federal election, just like our state has barely any power in a federal election, right? In Ohio, there was
given the huge population. I mean,
don't get me started.
But not the city. I know just Los Angeles County has more people than 27 different states.
Exactly. And I mean, I can go down a wormhole on how angry I am about how we run our federal elections as a Californian. Not to mention when you see New Hampshire and Iowa vote, and now we're saying that the presidential primary is over, right? When I haven't had a chance to vote yet. A lot of people haven't had a chance to vote yet, but definitely not California, which is like the economic powerhouse of most of this country. I lost where we were on the Ohio part.
Well, it was talking about how the monopolization of the growing had torn up the movement and was very contentious in Ohio. I found it very contentious as well. And
yeah, go ahead.
The investigative fund was based in Don Werkschafter's business in the Ohio Hempery. I've been doing business with Don for more than 30 years. I can take the company, but
Don is another one of those people who has been behind the scenes on a lot of things for a lot of years. People may not know his name, but he was there before you were. Do you know what I mean? Like he had a big part in legalization in the United States, and people don't see that as maybe they would if he was a little bit more out there with it. But Don was part of a local movement in Ohio of grassroots activists who had been working real hard to get medical cannabis passed. And right before Responsible Ohio, which was the campaign we're discussing, those activists that he worked with were really close to having a ballot initiative actually qualify, which is very difficult in Ohio. And their group was called the Ohio Rights Group. And what they would have done was enshrined in the Ohio Constitution the right to use cannabis for medical and adult use, right? Like this is a whole different thing. It's not just legalizing a commercial market, regulating a commercial market, taxing a commercial market. It's enshrining rights, like actual cannabis use as human rights. And this group was finally like getting real close to the ballot. And then all of a sudden, there's infighting, there's some drama, there's some weird things that happen. They never make the actual ballot, right? And then Responsible Ohio comes in with some of the activists who were in and around the org that helped kind of cause the problems that broke it, Org Ohio Rights Group, supporting Responsible Ohio. Responsible Ohio is looking like it's going to pass, even despite this whole 10 growers get to own the market thing. But the trolling and the infighting, caused so much that it started looking like it was about to not pass anymore. And that's when you start seeing some of those Responsible Ohio players playing behind the scenes with state legislators. So right after Responsible Ohio fails, now we're in November 2015, very beginning of 2016, legislators, conservative Republican legislators who had been against cannabis the whole time are coming out saying, we're going to pass a medical cannabis bill. And standing with them is one of the co-founders of the Responsible Ohio campaign, right? These investors invested in the market and they wanted their market. So they get medical cannabis in Ohio, right? And everything has just been really weird since then. A lot of the drama that happened on the ground in Ohio got taken up to Michigan, got taken out to California, to all these other places, right? And having done these deep dives on the legalization campaign and activist communities in different parts of this country, start noticing some patterns, right? The biggest pattern, of course, the obvious one, is following the money. You have the same big funders who come in to pass big bills, but usually you need someone on the ground who creates the momentum to make the investor realize it's worth it to kick money into Colorado legalization or Washington legalization. So you can't really discount these grassroots activist groups, because that's where it always starts. The sad thing to me is that it ends with those grassroots activist groups. They don't want to talk to each other anymore. A bunch of them leave the cannabis world completely afterwards. They stop fighting in the state houses to make the market right. You pass a law, super restrictive, all of a sudden, nobody's got the energy anymore to go fight up there, to go lobby up there, to go be having a voice to change the regulatory process and make these laws work for the people who need them to work, which is why patients still don't have access or safe access or quality access in places like Utah or even Ohio, which now has passed a legalization law, but we'll see how that rolls out, right? So it's interesting to me because there's not really as much of a unified activist community as there was when I first got into the cannabis world. And maybe that's just part of the natural progression. There's more people, there's more interests, there's more things going on, but it's also why we're going to have decades to come of trying to fix some of these laws as they are written now, because the momentum is gone. And the cannabis industry has definitely reached this place where in the past, and as you know, especially because you were there, in the past, even before my time, the cannabis industry and the cannabis community were one. Now we have two different things. We have the cannabis industry and the cannabis community, and sometimes they don't meet in the middle ever. And the community itself is just shrinking. I can go get my cannabis. I can stay away from the industry now if I want to, and I do. And that's kind of what I've seen happening. And I am working on putting it together in a book that tells this whole story from that vantage point of seeing what it looked like before the Ogden memo, seeing what happened as all these laws started passing, and then looking at where we are now. Because I feel like that story is not just about weed. It's about everything. It's about like every political movement in the United States. It's about people doing something to make change and the things that they confront when they're trying to make that change.
So we met when you first came to Oregon. How is it that you decided to come to Oregon, and how long did you live here? And let's talk about your time here.
So after high school, I was in the Bay Area for about 10 years, living between San Francisco and Oakland. And anybody who was in the Bay Area then knows exactly what was happening, which is rents were starting to just skyrocket. To the point where almost everybody I knew back then don't live in the Bay Area anymore. So I started seeing that writing on the wall, and my boyfriend, now my husband, and I both have family in Utah, and he had moved into a place in downtown Salt Lake City, and he told me, hey, your half of the rent would be $300 a month if you want to come live with me. And I said, okay, bye Oakland, right? So I just made a flash decision, loaded up my little Ford Taurus, and drove out to Salt Lake City and decided I was going to live there. And the interesting thing about that was the apartment that I lived in with him was right at the bottom of Capitol Hill. So across the street was Temple Square, which is the international center of Mormon power in the world, right? And then right up the hill from us was the state capitol. And of course, I've been active in cannabis industry stuff in the Bay Area for years before that. And part of me moving there was that I was still going back to the Bay Area about once a month, once every 6 weeks to work with all the people I worked with there. I was the editor of Cannabis Now magazine at the time, and they had an office in downtown Berkeley. I was still doing books with Ed, and all of the people I was interviewing with and working with were somewhere around the Bay Area for the most part. So I was going back and forth, bringing my cannabis back and forth. And within the first month of me being there, it was December, and I was like, I should meet some people. I should do something. I should find a way of figuring out what's going on with cannabis here. So I attended a Utah Normal meeting in downtown Salt Lake. And I remember having that be like one of the most terrifying nights of my life because I've never driven in ice or snow before, and the car slid the whole mile to get there. And the first night I was there, I met somebody who was working as an operative for the Democratic Party in Utah, which is not very powerful or impressive, and also a woman named Christine Stenquist. And Christine was sitting there with her mom and her daughter, talking about how she had a brain tumor that had basically taken her out of her life for 20 years. She was on pharmaceutical drugs, living in bed, not part of her children's life. Her teenager had told her she should try cannabis because he was hearing about it on social media, and all of a sudden she's dropping meds and walking and getting out and about, right? So I get to know Christine, and Christine, one of the first things she started doing just to kind of get out of her house and be out in the world was lobbying with a group called the Coalition of Religious Communities, CORC. And CORC lobbied the Utah State Legislature for human rights stuff, right? It it was things that everybody could get along with, right? There are Mormons, Sikhs, Muslims, Catholics, like everybody was part of this group doing human rights lobbying together. And they taught her how to lobby. And so at this point, I moved there in 2013. The new legislative session started at the beginning of 2014, which is when Salt Lake, Utah became the place that was going to pass the first ever CBD only law, right? So all of a sudden at the beginning of 2014, or it was the end of 2013, Sanjay Gupta came out with that special about children with epilepsy using CBD and it actually effectively treating their seizures. And so a couple months later, a group out of Utah put out this press release about Mormon mom wants cannabis for epileptic son. So it drives this whole movement to the state capitol for a CBD only law, right? And Christine is legislating, and she's coming to my apartment at the bottom of the Capitol Hill every day and telling me what they're saying about CBD and cannabis. And the whole time, I'm rolling us joints, showing her how to take dabs, and giving her all the talking points about why CBD only is not okay, and it's not enough, and they need to push further, right? Eventually, she starts dragging me up to the Capitol with her, too. So when she'd already found a legislator who was receptive to the message, she would bring me up to go talk to them and be able to answer all of their in-depth cannabis and science questions, right? And as I would meet people up there and hear their questions and go back to the Bay Area once a month, I would bring back more resources or get someone to agree to talk to this legislator for me, right? So Christine and I start independent of Utah NORML because it wasn't very functioning. We start kind of just the two of us being a little lobbying force for cannabis at the Capitol. And Christine in particular was really out in Salt Lake making friends in the political community. So early 2015, State Senator Mark Madsen, who's the Republican, libertarian, grandson of the Mormon prophet Ezra Taft Benson, decides that he this bill, but he can't find anybody to help him support it. He had back injuries his entire life. He almost died of a fentanyl overdose from a patch that was a 3-day patch that his doctor had prescribed him that broke and gave him the whole dose all at once. I'm not sure if it was fentanyl, but it was an opiate. So he was gung-ho for cannabis, but he didn't know where the support was. So Christine and I get introduced to Senator Mark Madsen, and he's like, okay, I got my people, I'm going to run a bill. So Christine ends up working with another mom named Tennille Farr. And Tennille she was very Mormon, had 5 children, a baby who was maybe 4 or 5 weeks old at the time. And she had cancer while she was pregnant. And a friend of hers had introduced her to Rick Simpson oil, full extract cannabis oil, and she delivered a healthy baby. So her and Christine were kind of the face of it in front of all the cameras with the baby and all, talking about medical cannabis and why Utah needed to pass this. And I would sit in Senator Madsen's office, hiding for the most part, but giving them talking points and making myself available to other legislators who were receptive. Because if the first thing that came out of my mouth was, I'm from California, I lived in the Bay Area, I work in the legalization industry, in the cannabis industry, that would shut down a lot of the conversation right off the bat. So they kind of kept me as their like ace in the hole in the office, where we need someone who knows what they're talking about. She'll tell you. She can call up a doctor for you. I know the researcher who can answer this question, right? So I was bringing in all these national experts that would talk to different legislators, or I would talk to them myself. I would give Tennille and Christine talking points for the media. We were polling at 70% support for that medical bill in Utah. And we brought it to final vote on the Senate, thinking we had enough votes to pass. And the president of the Senate had the deciding vote. We needed one more vote to pass it into the House. And right at the last minute, he kind of tricked us and killed the bill. And so him tricking us and killing that bill ended up starting an even bigger movement that led to Prop 2 in Utah. So Utah is now a medical cannabis state because of the work Christine did. At that point, I was getting really, really sick in 2015. And I knew that we wanted to leave Utah and go back to somewhere where it was safe and legal, but my husband was finishing his graduate degree in Salt Lake City. So in the middle of 2015, when he finished his degree, we're like, good, we're getting out of here. Don't want to go back to California, it's too expensive. I love the forest, let's move to Portland. So as soon as he finished school, we were on our way to Portland, Oregon, and I found my people again in Portland because it was real familiar to me. I would note that a lot of people in Oregon don't really like Californians very much, just the way they did in Utah. But I had a really good time in Portland, and it was a really cool experience to move to Portland when I did, because literally the day I drove across the Idaho line into Oregon was the day cannabis became legal in Utah and Oregon, right? They had just passed it in the election before, and I think it was July 1st of 2015 was the day it was legal. So as we're driving in from Utah and we get into Portland, we're looking off the freeway down to the bridges by the river in Portland, and there's massive parties and big smoke clouds for legalization. So it was definitely
on the Birdseye Bridge.
Yep, it was definitely a welcome back to the West Coast kind of vibe for me, and I was super happy to be in Portland that day.
So you worked on various projects here, and I know I think I first met you because you were writing an article for Cannabis Now magazine. You were still
You actually met me years before while I was working for Ed, probably over the phone more than anything. But I knew we had met and known who each other were before I got to Portland, pretty sure.
Yeah, we did. But then how is it that, tell me about your time in Oregon.
When I first got there, I was pretty sick. So to back up a little bit, while I was in San Francisco and I had gotten my Crohn's diagnosis and was using cannabis, I was also on a drug called Remicade. Remicade is an immunosuppressant drug, and it worked great for me for about 7 years. I was able to smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol and eat whatever I wanted, and I was fine, right? And I changed my insurance when I moved to Utah. It wasn't going to get covered anymore, and it had also stopped being as effective. So I was just like, you know what? Cannabis has cured my Crohn's disease. I don't need this. How wrong I was. Cannabis did not cure my Crohn's disease. And so I had started getting just very, very, very sick at the end of my time in Utah. And by the time I got to Oregon, I was already kind of at emergency surgery status again. So within a couple months of being in Utah, I was getting surgery. What was different about that, though, was that in Oregon, I had access to a naturopath. And I also had grown up a little bit since my teenage years when I was first diagnosed and started taking my health more seriously. I knew I didn't want to be on pharmaceutical drugs. I'd had lots of really bad experiences with them, and I knew cannabis wasn't enough either. So being in Oregon was actually really great for me at that time too, because I learned about the specific carbohydrate diet, which has been super effective for a ton of people with Crohn's disease, acupuncture, bodywork, meditation, sleep. Oddly, there's a really great study called Care and Feeding of the Endocannabinoid System, and it's a survey study that looks at all of the things that you can do as a human to either positively or negatively impact your endocannabinoid system. Cannabis isn't the only thing that interacts with that system. And that study really highlighted to me that you have to take a more holistic approach to wellness to be able to even treat serious diseases like Crohn's, right? You need to get enough sleep. You shouldn't be drinking alcohol. You shouldn't be smoking cigarettes. You need to drink a ton of water. And then I also removed all processed foods and sugars and grains from my diet. And now I'm happy to say it's been 8.5 years since that last surgery in Oregon. And since that time, I am still in remission without pharmaceutical drugs. So cannabis definitely taught me how to look at the world a little bit differently as a patient, but it was Oregon and being in Oregon and in the medical community in Oregon that pushed me over the edge to where I am today, where I can happily say that I don't really have Crohn's disease the same way somebody would say they have Crohn's disease. I'm not incapacitated. I'm not disabled. I'm not on drugs. I don't see a gastroenterologist anymore. I delivered a healthy baby 3 years ago, all without pharmaceutical intervention. And so Oregon was life-changing for me in that way because there's a different kind of medical approach there. Insurance covers things like acupuncture. It was just really, really different. Even in California, that stuff's not covered anymore. That was really cool for me. I would say with the cannabis community in Oregon, that was an interesting situation because some people didn't like me off the bat because I came from the Bay Area. Some people I already knew, like Madeline Martinez or you, and I leaned into those people a little bit more and really found some good friends while I was there. Madeline being one of my favorite mentors I have had in my life now, thanks to Oregon. And Madeline has really kind of taught me how to be a little bit more of a loud activist than I was before in the right way. And so I and Leah Flynn, right before I left Oregon, actually, we filed a ballot initiative in Oregon to legalize cannabis consumption, but it was also our omnibus, these are all the things that are wrong with legalization bill. And it was a really fun writing project for me, because if you go read the bill that we filed, it was well worded. These are all the things that are wrong with legalization. And if you're going to do the right thing, this is what we need to change. Stuff like making it so people can't get kicked out of their home for using medical cannabis, that people have safe places to consume, no drug testing for jobs, right? We had this whole omnibus bill of what it was. And I think we had a lot of people in the cannabis community who just loved it. But we also didn't have anybody in the business community who was willing to support it. So it didn't get very far. It was more of a statement that I think we were making than anything. And I'm sorry to say that we still don't have cannabis consumption lounges in Oregon. And here where I live now in the Central Coast of California, I've got 2 in town. One of them is literally across the street from me right now, because California did pass that bill with our legalization law. But yeah, Oregon was an interesting thing for me to see. And again, I was in the right place at the right time, just like I was in Utah, because I watched the rollout of one of the first legalization laws in the country. And Oregon was an interesting place to do that because one of the first legalization laws was right next door in Washington. And I still tell people to this day that the day the cannabis sales started in Oregon, I did an article for Cannabis Now where I was going around all the different lines at different dispensaries in Oregon, in Portland, to interview people who were waiting to buy cannabis legally for the first time. And I had done something similar in Colorado because I was living in Utah at the time. And in Colorado, people were coming from all around the world, all around the country, different states. And in Oregon, I would say that 85% of the people in line were like, nah, this is my neighborhood dispensary. I've just never been inside because I didn't get a medical card. I just want to see what it looks like on the inside. And the other 15% were people from Washington, which I thought was a really interesting study in cannabis legalization, is that you now had a whole ton of people coming into Oregon because Oregon legalized in a very free-for-all way compared to Washington. The prices were lower, the selection was better, the quality was better. The conditions that made Oregon what it was were really bad for the producers, but really great for consumers. And again, everybody who was out of state in that line were from Washington.
Yeah, they have a lot different system of multiple taxation on each different tier in Washington state.
You still can't grow at home in Washington. Even Connecticut, New Jersey, not New Jersey, Connecticut has home grow. New York's got home grow, right? How are we still here with Ohio has home grow and Washington doesn't?
Yeah, it's bizarre. It's very bizarre. I've been working with people trying to get home grow in Washington. The economic powers that be don't want it to happen. Some people don't know that in 2012, when the marijuana initiatives were passed in Washington and Colorado, and we lost here in Oregon, that the Marijuana Policy Project pushed it through in Colorado, and it was the Drug Policy Alliance that pushed it through in Washington. And it was me that pushed it through in Oregon for the 2012 initiative anyway. And so
there's this false perception in the MSO world, the multi-state operators, the big corporate cannabis operators, that home grow is going to cut into their business. The only thing that's cutting into their business is their shitty quality and high prices. Sorry, am I allowed to say that word?
You can, yeah. This is
okay. It's their shitty quality and their high prices, right? That's what's cutting into their business. Here in California, I can grow at home. Do I grow at home? No, I buy most of my stuff from a dispensary still. The last time I grew at home was when I was pregnant with my daughter, and after she was born, I just didn't care about it anymore. I let my plants die on the stalks because I just didn't care about it anymore, right? And so I like to point that out to people. Having home grow does not prevent people from going to dispensaries. I know people who've been lifelong growers who will still go into the dispensary because they want to see other things and buy other things, right? Home grow just helps people be self-sufficient if they don't have the option to go buy things, and it's not that big of a cut out of the commercial market.
Yeah, I home grow. I just basically, I haven't been in a dispensary in
You've got a unique home garden though. Not everybody's growing trees of cannabis in their backyard.
The Canadian corporate people took that big backyard away from us back in 2017. So
but you also have the experience of growing a tree, right? Rather than just a little bush.
Yeah, and I have access to good genetics, and that makes a big difference. But I haven't had to buy any in more than a year. But I understand that's different. I don't have a lot of disposable income. Anyway, so you left Oregon. Why did you leave, and what have you been doing since then?
To be cliche, I'm a California kid, and living in the weather in Oregon was a shock to my system, to be real. I loved Oregon summers. Beautiful. Oregon winters were hard on me. My husband grew up in Guayaquil, Ecuador. His American home was in the Bay Area, so he was used to sun too, and it was affecting us. Dad and I just didn't feel like people were that friendly sometimes to a Californian in Oregon, which was really unfortunate because I felt like we were never like that in the Bay Area. We loved having people from other places there. It's part of what made us cool. I hope Oregonians hear that. But I had the opportunity to move back to my hometown because of a house my parents were renting out to someone else that became available. But I had been telling them I was interested in coming back because after legalization passed in California, my little tiny hometown in North Santa Barbara County passed a free market law. So most of the state of California ended up banning commercial activity. My town said, we're going to let all license types go, including cannabis lounges. We're not going to add any taxes or rules over the state. Come on in, Lompoc is open for business. And so I was getting a little bit of FOMO in Oregon watching my hometown turn into this cannabis epicenter. And today, this county that I'm in, Santa Barbara County, grows 1/3 of the legal cannabis in the state of California. the town that I'm in, Lompoc, we have the only testing labs in the county. We've become a major distribution hub for the LA market because we're so close to these massive Santa Barbara County grows that are funding the market. And our free market here has meant that this town that has 40,000 within our borders, 60,000 outside of our borders, isolated on the coast highway away from like major roads, we have 16 dispensaries here. And because of that, the in-town competition is incredible. The prices are low, the quality is high, there's lots of competition, and everything like north and east of us is banned, is completely still prohibited commercial cannabis activity. So a lot of what's happening here is supplying most of Central California. We even have people driving up here. We're a 2-hour drive from Los Angeles. We still have people driving up here to shop on Black Friday and other holidays because our prices are that much lower than in the city of Los Angeles or the Los Angeles area. So I was getting serious FOMO watching this happen. I missed the sun, decided I really wanted to come back to California, and when the opportunity presented itself, we came back to California, and that was, again, weird timing, because we got back down here at the end of 2019, and then the pandemic started, so it kind of slowed the works of all the cannabis activity that was happening here and made it so we were locked inside, and again, I was super grateful to be here during that, because at the time in Oregon, they're having massive heat waves, pandemic, and a lot of wildfire smoke. And the place we were living in Oregon didn't have air conditioners, so that would have been probably one of the most torturous summers we would have lived through.
Yeah, we've had some trouble lately.
Yeah, it's been tough everywhere. Let's get real. Like here in California, we're not used to rain, and we've had some pretty intense storms in the last few weeks. And I mean, we lost a tree in our front yard.
Yeah, Santa Barbara was the epicenter of this recent atmospheric river. That's a term that we didn't used to have in the old days, but it's become pretty common now.
It's weird too, because when I was a kid and we would have storms, it was always cold rain, and it only happened in the winter. And we've been having these storms here where it gets like in the 70s, 75 degrees. It was 80 degrees the week before these storms happened. It's like a tropical storm. It gets like wet and humid. It feels like you're on the East Coast, which I had never experienced in California before. And then it just starts dumping water and wind. I was actually most of the worst of what happened in Santa Barbara County was a little bit away from me. I wasn't really that affected. We did have a tree go down, a really old tree go down in our front yard. But it's fine.
It didn't destroy cars or buildings, I hope.
Not in my town. Most of the flooding was in the Santa Barbara area, and I'm about 40 minutes northwest of Santa Barbara.
So we're getting down on time here. The very first book that your company, FlowerValley.press, put out is Dr. Joe Goldstrich, The Cannabis Cancer Connection, which is a great book. I've recommended it to many cancer patients since then. But you say a new one's coming out with Dr. Behrman and you and a couple other people whose name I don't recall. It's coming out in March. Is that what's?
Yeah, it's called Cannabis in Clinical Practice. And again, this is everything that doctors, patients, and caregivers need that are usually the drug facts you would get with a pharmaceutical drug that's gone through clinical trials that you don't get with cannabis. But it also has standards from Dr. Behrman's clinical practice, and it's designed to be used as something that patients and caregivers can use to help self-guide themselves because they're not getting that from a doctor, but also the kind of thing that they can then hand to their doctor that has what their doctor needs to actually start incorporating cannabis into their clinical practice. Another big piece of that book is Dr. Pettinato, who teaches at the College of Nursing at Seattle University, has created training materials around it to use in higher ed. And one of the big goals of this book is that, I'm sure the numbers maybe changed a little bit, but at the time of writing, only 12% of medical schools even taught of the existence of the endocannabinoid system. And to go back to what I was saying about my own personal medical journey with Crohn's disease, all of the things that I do now are meant to target the endocannabinoid system. Most of them aren't cannabis, right? Like the endocannabinoid system is something that every doctor, medical professional should know and be trying to understand better.
And so it modulates the whole nervous system. It modulates your brain and all of your nerves.
But here's the other thing we're learning about it, right? Like pharmaceutical drugs are standardized. People aren't standardized, but the drugs we take are, and that's because it makes them easier to go through these very rigorous clinical trials. The compounds that we've found in cannabis that interact with the endocannabinoid system, including cannabinoids, are found in like most other plants. Cannabinoids only in a few plants, but terpenes, flavonoids, phenols, like aldehydes, like all of these things are in other plants. So it's kind of an argument to bring herbalism and diet back into medical care because it affects the endocannabinoid system. So one of our big goals with this book is to bring that education to medical professionals, to promote more education on the endocannabinoid system and the things that affect it. The acupuncture, right, which I experienced for the first time as a patient in Oregon, targets the endocannabinoid system. That's how it works. It's actually targeting the endocannabinoid system. There's things like this that people are not even aware of, and our doctors aren't aware of, and we need to push our doctors in that direction, right? I feel like if I had done everything that my doctors had told me to do, I would be clinically disabled. I would be clinically disabled because I would be taking Humira, which gave me arthritis and migraines, which would lead to more drugs, to the point where I don't have a life anymore. And instead, I went for cannabis. Cannabis wasn't enough, but it taught me about the endocannabinoid system. And now everything I do is targeted at creating balance in that system. Whether that's ensuring I get 8 hours a night of sleep, or making sure I'm drinking a gallon of water a day or as close to it as I can get, that I'm eating well, that I'm getting physical movement, like all of these things affect the endocannabinoid system. That and herbs and herbalism. One of the things that I learned in Utah was, so the Mormon mom who was supporting the bill with my friend Christine, she really learned about cannabis by another Angela Harris, who was a 5th-generation herbalist in Las Vegas. And Angela ran what was called the Underground Mormon Railroad, is what they were calling it, or the Mormon Caravan. And what they were doing was, before medical cannabis passed in Utah, after all of the stuff started coming out about epilepsy and cancer with cannabis, she helped run a network that was moms in Southern California who were Mormons, who would have a little chain of cars going up I-15 to Salt Lake and passing cannabis off the whole way. So someone in Southern California would ferry it to Las Vegas, who would ferry it up to Salt Lake. And these were all a bunch of Mormon moms who did this. I'm sorry, I've got some Bob Marley blasting from my garage right now. Do you hear that?
I can hear it a little bit, but that's okay. We are about out of time. So we'd love to have you back at some point. So your next book out is the Cannabis Clinician's Guide. Is that the name?
Cannabis in Clinical Practice. I also highly recommend The Cannabis Cancer Connection by Dr. Joe Goldstretch. That one is everything anybody needs to know about the modern body of research on cancer and cannabis, as well as everything we've learned anecdotally from the patient communities who've been really pushing this in the use of full extract oil, aka Rick Simpson oil. Also highly, highly, highly recommend High Price by Luke Scarmazzo, which was our second book. And that book is a page turner. It's a novel, and it's the story of Luke Scarmazzo, who opened the first cannabis dispensary in the Central Valley of California and was targeted by the feds, served 14 years in federal prison, watched legalization roll out around him for what he was in prison for, and was released a year ago this month. Luke's got a crazy story to tell, and I highly recommend reading High Price.
Okay, well, you can pick those up on where? Amazon?
Amazon.com, or you can check out FlowerValley.press to get to each of the individual sites that will tell you more about the authors and the books themselves.
All right, well, that's been a great. But if someone wants to reach out to Flower Valley Press, what's the best way to do so?
There's a contact form on our website, FlowerValley.press, or you can email me at Angela@FlowerValley.press. My name is Angela.
Okay, sounds great. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. And I'll be looking for that Cannabis Clinician's Guide. What's the name again?
Cannabis in Clinical Practice. And I'll reach out to you. And if you want to even just send me a mailing address right now, I'll make sure you get a copy when it's out.
Oh, yeah, please. I will. Okay, well, thank you. We've had Angela Bacca with Flower Valley Press, longtime friend, and keep working to restore hemp.